2:31 in the pre-dawn hours of June 6, 1996. A mother's voice, shrill with a terror that curdled the blood, tore through the silence as she called 911. Her 2 sons, she screamed, were bleeding out in the living room. "Oh, my God! Oh, my God!" An intruder, she insisted, had breached the sanctity of their home, attacked her children, then turned on her, before vanishing into the night, escaping across the dew-kissed grass. Police arrived to a tableau of violence, meticulously arranged. Knives. Shattered glass. The very air in that living room seemed to hum with a discordant energy, a story that began to unravel even before the first officer could process its impossible contours. What initially appeared to be a brutal home invasion twisted, almost immediately, into something far more sinister. The hunt for an unknown assailant quickly dissolved, the lens of suspicion, once cast wide, narrowed with an almost predatory focus. The sole adult victim still standing in that house of horrors would soon become the primary suspect. Darlie Lynn Routier. Born on January 4, 1970, in Altoona, Pennsylvania, Darlie's early life was pieced together from fractured beginnings. Her parents, Darlie and Hillary Peck, separated when she was still a child. Her mother, Hillary, later remarried Robbie King, moving them to the sun-baked plains of Lubbock, Texas. It was there, within the bustling walls of the restaurant where her mother worked, that a 15-year-old Darlie met Darren Routier. He was a cook, 2 years her senior, and together they would forge a path that, from the outside, seemed destined for prosperity. They married in August, 1988. That same year, she finished school and e-whirled to sea. Darren launched an electronics and computer business, and for a time, it thrived. They settled in Rowlett, a suburb of Dallas, Texas, and there, they began to form the family that would forever be captured in home videos and photographs. Devin, their first son, arrived on June 14, 19 on October 18, 1995. In their affluent neighborhood, they were the picture of stability, a family without visible problems, radiating success. Darlie baked cookies for the children next door, a gesture of neighborly warmth. On one occasion, the couple extended their generosity, offering financial aid to a friend, a person battling the insidious grip of cancer. To all outward appearances, nothing hinted at the abyss that lay waiting just beneath the surface. This is the house. In wonderful. The carefully constructed facade was, indeed, wonderful. But beneath the polished surface, fissures ran deep, unseen by casual observers. By 1996, the vibrant hum of Darren's business had begun to falter, replaced by the insidious whisper of decline. The prosperity, once so vibrant, had started to wither. Unpaid mortgage installments accumulated, each one a tiny crack in the foundation of their carefully constructed world. Over $20,000 in crushing debt, taxes, credit cards, bank loans, pressed down on them. A bank loan, their last desperate hope, a lifeline, was rejected just days before the night of terror. They weren't completely ruined, no, not yet. But the precipitous fall from their once opulent lifestyle was a descent into a financial nightmare, a quiet desperation that gnawed at their sense of security. At the same time, Darlie herself navigated a treacherous emotional landscape in the wake of Drake's birth, a storm brewing within her, perhaps unseen by those closest. The weight of the world, or at least her world, pressed down with an unbearable force. The perfect life was a perfect lie. She felt the weight of the world pressing down, a crushing exhaustion that seeped into her bones, stealing sleep, leaving her adrift in the dark currents of postpartum depression. Her body, a landscape irrevocably altered by motherhood, became another source of silent torment, a constant, unwelcome reflection. To numb the edges of her despair, she turned to medication, among them fen, a drug promising a fleeting escape from the relentless demands of her own skin. Her diary, a private confidant, bore witness to a mind fractured by opposing forces. Some pages sang with the simple joys of domesticity, filled with tender words for her husband, her children, the quiet comfort of their home. But then, the ink would darken, the entries twisting into something far more sinister, a chilling glimpse into an abyss she skirted. One passage, in particular, stood out, a stark, desperate confession of an escape she contemplated, a final, irreversible silence. It read, "Devon, Damon, and Drake, I hope you can forgive me for what I am doing. My life has been a good life for a long time, and I cannot find the strength to be in it anymore. I love you three more than anything in this world, and I want all three of you to be very content and happy. And I do not want to see a very miserable man every time you look at me." The words hung in the air, a phantom whisper of a woman teetering on a precipice, a desperate plea for understanding from a future that would never truly comprehend. The night of June 5, 1996, unfurled with the deceptive calm of any other. Darley's sister, Deanna, stopped by after work, her presence a familiar comfort in the evening air. They talked, their voices a low hum, while the children, full of the day's last energy, chased imaginary monsters in the twilight of the backyard. The mundane rhythm of family life, utterly unremarkable, yet soon to be shattered beyond recognition. Later, Darren drove Deanna home, a brief, ordinary errand. Upon his return, the family gathered in the living room, a final huddle before sleep claimed them. Devon and Damon, the older boys, retrieved blankets and pillows, settling down to watch television, their young bodies eventually succumbing to slumber right there on the floor. Darren then carried baby Drake upstairs to the master bedroom on the second floor, the soft thud of his footsteps echoing the quiet end of the day. Darley, however, chose to remain downstairs, near her two sleeping sons. She later claimed the baby's restless nights had left her perpetually sleep-deprived, and she believed the living room sofa might offer a chance at undisturbed rest, a brief reprieve from the exhausting cycle of motherhood. Darren stayed with her, talking softly, until well past midnight, before finally ascending the stairs to check on Drake. According to Darley's own chilling account, the world shifted shortly before 2:31 in the morning. A gentle, insistent touch on coo. Her eyes, still heavy with sleep, struggled to focus in the dim light. Then, a figure. A man, tall, white, dressed in jeans, a dark shirt, and a cap, moving away from her, disappearing into the shadowy space that connected the living room to the kitchen and utility area. A fleeting glimpse, a phantom presence. She claimed to have heard the distinct, brittle sound of glass shattering, a sharp punctuation mark in the oppressive silence. A primal fear seized her, propelling her forward. She ran towards the kitchen, her bare feet slapping against the cold floor. There, amidst the growing horror, she saw it, a large knife, discarded on the floor. Her hand reached for it, her fingers closing around the cold, slick handle. It was then, in that horrifying moment of contact, that she realized the true, visceral nature of the terror. The blade, the handle, her hand, all were drenched in blood. Immediately, a guttural scream tore from her throat, a sound that ripped through the quiet house, summoning Darren from upstairs. Simultaneously, she fumbled for the telephone, her trembling fingers dialing 911, her voice a raw, desperate rasp against the operator's calm query. As she spoke, her words choked with panic, Darren burst down the stairs, his eyes wide with a dawning horror. He rushed to the boys, his hands fumbling, trying to comprehend the devastation. Both Devon and Damon lay gravely wounded, their small bodies already fading. The living room, the very floor beneath them, and parts of the kitchen, were awash in a grotesque crimson tide. From its very first utterance, that 911 call became more than just a plea for help, it became a meticulously dissected artifact, a chilling audio tapestry woven into the fabric of the entire, confounding case. A single, desperate breath, forever trapped in time. The scream tore through the pre-dawn silence, a raw, primal sound that clawed at the edges of the night. Darley's voice, ragged with terror, pierced the telephone line, a desperate plea for help. Someone, she insisted, had broken into the house. Someone had stabbed her sons. Her voice, trembling and fractured, demanded an ambulance, the urgency in her tone unmistakable. For some, listening back to that chilling recording, her desperation felt achingly real, a mother's soul-shattering anguish echoing through the receiver. But for others, a subtle undercurrent, a strange, almost unsettling control, seemed to weave through the chaos. It was a detail that would haunt the case, an unsettling whisper in the dark. The prosecution would later seize upon a single phrase, repeating it, dissecting it, letting it hang heavy in the courtroom air. When the emergency operator, her voice calm amidst the rising panic, instructed Darlie not to touch anything, Darlie's reply came back, clear and chillingly composed. "I think if I hadn't touched it, we might have been able to get fingerprints." For the state, that response did not emanate from a mother reeling in the shock of unimaginable horror. Fingerprints an intruder might have left behind, or perhaps, the fingerprints that she might have left. It was a thought that curdled the blood. The defense, however, painted a different picture, the confused, disoriented reaction of a grievously wounded woman, terrified and struggling to comprehend the monstrous tableau that had just unfolded before her eyes. A mind grappling with the unfathomable, trying to make sense of a world suddenly ripped apart. Police cars, sirens wailing, sliced through the darkness, arriving within minutes. Paramedics, their faces grim, entered the house at precisely 2:40 in the morning. Devon, the eldest, was already gone, his young life extinguished before help could arrive. Damon, however, still clung to a fragile thread of existence. His eyes were open, wide and unseeing, but he could not speak, his small body ravaged by the attack. He was rushed to the hospital, a desperate race against time, but even the most heroic efforts proved futile. He succumbed to his wounds a short time later. Darlie, too, bore injuries, and was transported by ambulance, her screams now replaced by the muffled sounds of medical attention. Upstairs, untouched by the carnage, lay Drake, the infant, innocent and oblivious. Darren, Darlie's husband, and their other child, Lesso, were also found unharmed. From the very first moments, the scene presented two starkly different narratives. A window in the garage, its pane removed or cut, immediately suggested an entry or exit point for an unseen assailant. It was a detail that pointed outward, beyond the family. Inside, chaos reigned. A coffee table lay overturned, shards of glass scattered signs of a violent struggle. It was a scene designed to scream, "Intruder." But as the initial shock began to recede, as the seasoned eyes of law enforcement began to truly see the scene, the focus began to shift. Instead of a relentless hunt for someone outside the very epicenter of the tragedy, wounded yet standing. In the quiet suburban streets of Rowlett, Texas, a community built on the illusion of safety, something deeply unsettling was taking root. Among the most perplexing discoveries was a single sock, found discarded approximately 70 meters from the house. It was a seemingly innocuous item, yet its contents were anything but. This sock, ordinary in appearance, was saturated with the blood of both Devon and Damon, and chillingly, it also contained Darlie's DNA. The prosecution would later argue, with cold precision, that Darlie herself must have carried or thrown the sock there, a deliberate act intended to fabricate evidence of an intruder's flight. It was a calculated move, they claimed, to divert attention, to construct a narrative of external threat where none existed. The defense, conversely, contended that the sock was one of the few pieces of physical evidence that did align with the presence of an actual intruder, someone fleeing in haste, perhaps dropping it in their desperate escape. It was a crucial detail, they insisted, that pointed away from Darlie, not toward her. To this day, the mystery of that sock remains one of the most uncomfortable questions of the entire case. How did it come to rest so far from the house? And how swiftly could it have appeared there, a silent, bloody testament to a truth still obscured? As Darlie remained hospitalized, recovering from her injuries, the investigation began to coalesce, taking on a disturbingly clear direction. James Kohler, a crime scene analyst of legendary reputation, though officially retired, was called back into service. His vast experience and the sheer gravity of the case demanded his unique insight. Kohler would later recount the exact moment suspicion first pricked at the edges of his professional detachment. He began to suspect a possible staging, he revealed, a mere 20 or 30 minutes after stepping foot inside that house. That chilling, immediate realization, born from decades of walking through the darkest corners of human depravity, would irrevocably sh. The coffee table, the shattered wine glass, the vacuum cleaner lying overturned, these scattered fragments of domestic chaos, once interpreted as the violent aftermath of a struggle, began to coalesce into something far more chilling. Tea never truly happened. The absence of blood in key areas, a silent witness, further eroded the narrative of a brutal home invasion. Where one would expect crimson stains to tell a story of desperate defense, there was only an unsettling void, a clean expanse that spoke not of an intruder's haste, but of a deliberate, calculated omission. No compelling evidence emerged to suggest anyone had actually breached the garage window, no definitive scuff marks or disturbed dust to confirm entry or exit through that supposed point of intrusion. It was a phantom breach, a doorway to nowhere. And then, the other details began to surface, each one a tiny, unsettling tremor beneath the surface of the official story. The undisturbed layer of dust, pristine in places where a fleeing assailant's footsteps should have left their telltale marks. The motion sensor light in the backyard, designed to flare to life at the slightest movement, remained stubbornly dark when the first officers arrived. There was no real disarray, no frantic upheaval that spoke of a desperate escape. The knife. A common kitchen knife, pulled from the family's own block, became the instrument of unimaginable horror. This single, devastating detail struck at the very core of Darley's public image, becoming a cornerstone of the prosecution's relentless argument. Its origin, so intimately tied to the heart of the home, transformed it from a mere weapon into a symbol of betrayal. The state's forensic experts, during their meticulous examination, claimed to have found something else on a bread knife from the very same kitchen. Microscopic fibers, they asserted, that could match the torn screen of the garage window. If that bread knife, a mundane tool of daily life, had been used to slice through the screen, then the supposed entry of an intruder was no forced breach from the outside. It was a meticulously prepared act, orchestrated from within the confines of the house itself. Years later, the defense would attempt to unravel this damning conclusion. They argued the expert had not stated with absolute certainty that this specific knife was used, only that it could have been. They also posited the possibility of contamination, suggesting the knife had already been handled in the laboratory with tools that might have introduced similar fibers. But in January of 1997, before the jury, these nuances were lost. The assertion was presented not as a possibility, but as an undeniable, chilling fact. Another crucial discrepancy, meticulously highlighted by the prosecution, lay in the very nature of the wounds themselves. The children, Devon and Dave, had suffered injuries of unimaginable severity. Darley, on the other hand, bore a cut on her hand, a single wound to her arm, and several bruises. The logic seemed stark and unforgiving. If an intruder possessed the capacity for such brutal, unbridled violence against two small, defenseless children, it defied all reason that the same assailant would then leave an adult, a potential witness capable of identification, with wounds comparatively minor. And then, the final, chilling piece of the puzzle. The kitchen itself, silent and stark, seemed to whisper a terrible secret. Evidence suggested Darley had inflicted her own wound over the sink. The prosecution's message, delivered with cold precision, was simple and utterly devastating. First, the unimaginable act against her children, then the calculated escape. But with the passage of time, another facet of the story began to emerge, one that shattered the seamless narrative the prosecution had woven. Darley's hemoglobin levels painted a stark picture of significant blood loss. She received a diagnosis of acute anemia due to hemorrhage and underwent surgery that lasted for almost an hour. These were not the superficial, easily faked injuries of someone merely pretending. The wound to her neck, in particular, had come within mere millimeters of a vital artery. It was not a staged performance. It was a desperate fight for life. The defense painted a different picture, one etched in flesh and metal. They pointed to the wounds Darlie sustained, lacerations on her arm, defensive marks across her fingers. These were not the self-inflicted scratches of a deceiver, they argued, but the desperate, visceral evidence of a struggle, a woman fighting for her life against an unseen attacker. And then there was the necklace, a fragile chain she had worn that night. It was found damaged, twisted, its delicate links bent and broken, as if ripped from her throat in a violent assault, a silent testament to a terror that unfolded in the dark. None of this, of course, erased the shadow of suspicion that clung to her, a persistent, chilling doubt. But these details, these tangible pieces of evidence, at the very least, fractured the neat, horrifying narrative that Darlie had orchestrated her own torment. They whispered of an alternative, a brutal reality where she, too, had been a victim. The prosecution, however, saw not the victim of a home invasion, but a woman whose emotional landscape seemed alien, unsettling. They meticulously scrutinized her every reaction, every gesture, every fleeting expression, from the chilling calm of her 911 call to her demeanor in the stark white confines of the hospital. They watched her at the funeral, in the quiet, grief. They called to the stand nurses, police officers, paramedics, those first responders who witnessed raw, unvarnished trauma. Initially, these professionals had documented a woman in profound distress, weeping, inconsolable. But as the trial progressed, their recollections shifted, morphing into something colder, more detached. They described Darlie as strangely unaffected, unusually composed, even petulant. A woman who, in their eyes, did not grieve as a mother should. Years later, allegations surfaced. Defense attorneys claimed that prosecutors had shown some of these medical personnel, prior to their testimony, extremely graphic photographs of the crime scene. Images so visceral, so disturbing, they could easily warp perception, subtly influencing how these professionals might later recall Darlie's behavior. Was it the truth of Darlie's demeanor, or the insidious power of suggestion, planted by images designed to harden hearts and minds? On June 14, 1996, on what would have been Devon's 7th birthday, just 8 days after the unspeakable horror, the family gathered at the cemetery. First, a solemn religious ceremony unfolded, a quiet tribute to the two young lives violently extildered and repulsed. They celebrated what would have been Devon's 7th birthday. Balloons, bright and buoyant, were brought to the graveside. A cake, adorned with candles, was placed upon the earth. They sang. They laughed. They scattered streamers over the small, fresh graves, a carnival of color against the stark reality of death. But the country, glued to its television screens, did not see the whole picture. Only this strange, unsettling spectacle was broadcast, not the raw, agonizing moments that preceded it, when the family had wept openly, their grief unrestrained and palpable. On television, the scene caused an immediate, visceral backlash. For countless viewers, it was a portrait of profound depravity, a mother, smiling, chewing gum, laughing beside the graves of her two murdered sons. It was, for many, the chilling confirmation that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong with her. They hadn't seen the full story. They hadn't seen any of it. Darlie was arrested on June 18, 1996. The trial commenced on January 6, 1997, with Toby Shuck and Greg Davies leading the prosecution. They made a calculated decision to pursue charges solely for the murder of Damon. His age, under 6 years old, allowed them to seek the death penalty. The state's case rested on 6 chilling pillars. First, they painted Darlie as a woman consumed by materialism, utterly fixated on her appearance, her life a meticulously crafted facade. Second, her story, they argued, shifted and fractured with each retelling, a tapestry of lies unraveling under scrutiny. Third, her reaction when confronted about the knife was deemed suspicious, her detachment unsettling. Fourth, the prosecution pointed to her failure to even attempt to help her children. The prosecution painted a stark, unforgiving picture. They claimed the scene, initially presented as a home invasion gone horribly wrong, was nothing more than a meticulously constructed lie. No forced entry. No signs of an intruder. Every shattered piece, every overturned object, every whisper of chaos, all of it, they argued, was a carefully orchestrated performance designed to mask an unspeakable truth. Then came the motive, cold and sharp as a surgeon's blade. They spoke of life insurance policies, each valued at $5,000 for every child lost. They laid bare a life teetering on the edge of financial ruin, a relentless pursuit of designer clothes, glittering jewelry, and lavish shopping sprees. The narrative unfolded with a chilling precision: a breast augmentation surgery, a desperate attempt to cling to a lifestyle that had long since become unsustainable. The image they carved for the jury was not one of a woman consumed by grief or shattered by crisis. It was the portrait of a woman driven by a profound, corrosive selfishness, a woman who, they contended, had finally exploded against the very lives that had become inconvenient obstacles in her path. The defense, even before the first gavel struck, found itself adrift in treacherous waters. Douglas Parks, the initial attorney assigned to the case, was abruptly replaced by Douglas Mulder. This change occurred a mere 9 weeks before the trial was set to begin. In a case where the stakes were nothing less than a life sentence, such a last-minute shift in counsel was not just a disadvantage, it was a gaping wound, bleeding away precious time needed to construct any semblance of a robust defense. Parks had, in fact, taken crucial steps. He had enlisted 2 specialists, Terry Laver and Bart Epstein, to forensically dissect the crime scene and meticulously review the physical evidence. These experts had already unearthed significant discrepancies, points of contention that could have cast a long shadow of doubt over the prosecution's seemingly airtight narrative. For instance, the position of the vacuum cleaner, they argued, did not definitively prove it had been moved after the attack. The broken glass, too, could not, on its own, serve as irrefutable proof of a staged event. Yet, Mulder, inexplicably, failed to pursue this vital groundwork. He never called Laver or Epstein to the stand, never allowed them to articulate these crucial doubts before the jury, leaving these potential cracks in the prosecution's edifice unexplored, unexamined, and ultimately, unheard. The situation spiraled into an even more perilous abyss, entangled by Mulder's deeply troubling relationship with Darren, Darley's husband. Appellate documents would later reveal that Mulder was simultaneously representing Darren in a separate, yet intrinsically linked, matter connected to the very same case. More disturbing still, it was alleged that Mulder had made a solemn promise to Darren, a vow that he would never, under any circumstances, implicate Darren as a potential suspect during Darley's defense. This was not merely a conflict of interest, it was a profound ethical chasm, a silent agreement that threatened to bury any chance of a fair trial. There were, after all, several disquieting threads surrounding Darren that demanded rigorous investigation, threads that could have easily woven him into the fabric of suspicion. There was talk of a life insurance policy, a staggering $250,000, taken out on Darley's life. Then came the chilling discovery: bloodstains found on Darren's clothing, marks that whispered of proximity to the violence, of an involvement that defied his initial accounts. And perhaps most damning, a later declaration surfaced, a confession from Darren himself, admitting that prior to the crime, he had engaged in conversations with others, discussing the feasibility of staging a robbery at their home specifically to collect on an insurance payout. None of these elements, standing alone, definitively proved Darren's culpability. But together, they formed a mosaic of suspicion, a compelling need for a deeper, more probing inquiry. The defense, bound by its unspoken promise, never ventured down that path. Even the prosecution, observing the unfolding legal charade, felt compelled to issue a stark warning, acknowledging the undeniable potential for a severe conflict arising from Mulder's dual representation. The truth, it seemed, was not merely hidden. It was actively, deliberately, suppressed. The relentless machinery of justice ground forward. Despite the glaring inconsistencies, the troubling shadows that stretched across the evidence, the trial moved, inexorably, towards its grim conclusion. And in those final, suffocating days, something profoundly unsettling began to solidify. The state's experts, their voices calm, their presentations precise, laid out their version of events. Their narrative, meticulously constructed, unfolded before the jury with an almost surgical precision, often without a truly formidable technical counter-argument from the defense. Charles Lynch, a name now etched into the chilling annals of this case, spoke of microscopic fibers, of unseen connections, and of a common bread knife, an ordinary kitchen tool transformed into an instrument of unspeakable horror. His words painted a picture of calculated violence, the mundane weapon now imbued with a terrifying significance. Then came Tom Bevel, his testimony focusing on the silent language of blood. The stains on Darley's clothing, he asserted, were not random splashes. They were patterns, silent witnesses that spoke of kinetic energy, of a weapon in motion, wielded by a hand. The prosecution hammered this point home. The crimson spray on the back of the shirt, they argued, was a direct consequence of the repeated, brutal thrusts of the blade. It was a narrative of active participation, of a killer in a frenzy. The defense, in turn, offered an alternative, a desperate counter-narrative. Those same stains, they contended, could have been generated in the frantic, chaotic aftermath. They could have been the tragic consequence of Darley's desperate attempts to aid Demon, to staunch the flow of life from his tiny body, as Darren fought to revive him. Darley, they pleaded, was simply too close, too immersed in the horror, for the blood to tell a different story. It was an explanation born of the raw, visceral terror of that night, yet it struggled to gain purchase against the cold, clinical pronouncements of the state's forensic experts. The true problem was not merely that the prosecution presented its interpretation, but that the jury, time and again, heard only that singular, potent version, echoing in the quiet of the courtroom, without an equally robust, equally compelling rebuttal. The scales of justice, it seemed, were already tipped. But the dark threads of this case extended far beyond the courtroom's walls, weaving into the very fabric of the investigation itself. Detective Jimmy Patterson, an officer sworn to uphold the law, had authorized the installation of a recording device. Not in a suspect's home, not in a clandestine meeting, but in a cemetery. A place of hallowed ground, of quiet grief. This device was meant to capture the raw, unguarded anguish of the family during Demon's funeral, and later, on what would have been his birthday. An invasion of the most profound and sacred moments of mourning. When the defense pressed him on this shocking breach of privacy, Patterson invoked the Fifth Amendment, a shield designed to protect the accused, now wielded by the very hand of the law. He refused to answer, his silence a stark, unsettling admission. Yet, despite this egregious ethical violation, this clear overreach, the trial was not annulled. It continued, uninterrupted, a testament to the lengths law enforcement was willing to go, the boundaries they were prepared to cross, to secure a conviction against Darley. The pursuit of justice, in this instance, seemed to have strayed into the shadows of obsession. Further revelations chipped away at any remaining faith in the integrity of the investigation. The crime scene, that crucial tableau from which truth was meant to be meticulously extracted, was revealed to have been compromised, not by an unknown intruder, but by the very officers tasked with its preservation. A muddy boot print, initially a potential clue, was traced back to a police officer. A strand of hair, once presented as a possible link to Darley, later proved to belong to a female officer. Each discovery eroded the illusion of a pristine, untainted scene. With every passing day, the notion that the evidence had been collected without error, without contamination, became a fragile, untenable fiction. The very ground upon which the prosecution built its case began to crumble, leaving behind a chilling uncertainty. Then, the prosecution pivoted, shifting their assault from forensic evidence to character. They embarked on a calculated campaign to dismantle Darley's very essence, to paint her as a woman so morally bankrupt, so inherently flawed, that she must, by definition, be capable of such a heinous act. She was portrayed as superficial, a creature of vanity, consumed by her appearance, devoid of genuine spiritual conviction, her morals questionable at best. Prosecutor Greg Davies, his voice resonating with an almost evangelical fervor, went so far as to declare her the embodiment of evil. His words, carefully chosen, were designed to resonate with the most conservative sensibilities of the jury, a calculated appeal to their prejudices, delivered in a tone that, today, would be impossible to justify. They fixated on her breast augmentation, on her spending habits, on the clothes she wore, on whether or not she took her children to church. None of these details, not a single one, offered any tangible proof of who wielded the knife in the pre-dawn hours of that terrible morning. Yet, they served a more insidious purpose. They meticulously constructed an atmosphere of condemnation, a suffocating shroud of judgment that settled over Darlie. The presumption of guilt, once rooted in tangible evidence, now blossomed from something far more insidious: the chilling, unspoken belief that she was simply the type of woman who could commit such an atrocity. When Darlie stepped onto the witness stand, her image, her very essence, had already been thoroughly, irrevocably, tainted. The prosecution, with surgical precision, had carved two indelible impressions into the minds of the jury. First, that her testimony was a shifting mirage, constantly altering its shape and substance. Second, that her demeanor, her reactions, were utterly irreconcilable with the raw, gut-wrenching grief of an innocent mother. The prosecutors, relentless in their pursuit, declared she had twisted her narrative no less than 8 distinct times. Each iteration, they argued, was a conscious fabrication, a desperate attempt to patch the widening holes in her story. At one moment, she claimed the faint cry of her son, Damon, had roused her from sleep. A chilling whisper in the pre-dawn darkness. Yet, in another telling, she insisted it was the sharp, violent splintering of glass that had jolted her awake, a sound that tore through the quiet night. Sometimes, her account included a desperate struggle, a physical confrontation with an unseen assailant, a phantom figure grappling in the shadows. Then, without warning, that detail would vanish, replaced by the fleeting glimpse of a man, a mere silhouette disappearing into the oppressive darkness, a figure she barely had time to register before he was gone. These were not minor discrepancies, the prosecution hammered home, but fundamental contradictions, each one a nail in the coffin of her credibility. The defense, scrambling to salvage what little remained, offered explanations steeped in the language of trauma and despair. They painted a picture of a woman reeling from unspeakable horror, her memories fractured by shock, her body ravaged by injuries, her mind clouded by the potent cocktail of medications prescribed to dull her pain. Perhaps, they suggested, the very substances meant to bring her solace had instead blurred the edges of reality, leaving her recollections confused, unreliable. But to the prosecution, these were not mitigating factors. They were further proof, stark and undeniable, that she was weaving a tangled web of lies. In a case devoid of a confession, a case lacking a single direct witness to the brutal act, Darlie's own words were her primary, perhaps her only, defense. To strip her of that credibility, to brand her a liar in the eyes of the jury, was to leave her utterly defenseless, exposed to the full, unyielding force of the state. Craig Davis, the lead prosecutor, understood this chilling dynamic with an almost predatory clarity. His closing argument was a masterclass in psychological warfare. He didn't just speak, he performed, his voice a hammer striking at the foundations of Darlie's defense. He drew chilling parallels between Darlie and other women, mothers, convicted of the unthinkable crime of harming their own children. He attacked her character, her every perceived flaw, with a ferocity that seemed designed not just to convict, but to provoke. He pressed, he pushed, until the dam of her composure finally, spectacularly, burst. The courtroom, usually a place of rigid decorum, erupted as Darlie, her face contorted in a mask of raw anguish and fury, screamed a single word at Davis: liar. It was a primal shriek, tearing through the tense silence, echoing off the polished wood and hushed whispers. But by then, Davis had already achieved his objective. Her outburst, a raw, uncontrolled display of rage, was precisely the image he had sought to etch into the jury's collective consciousness. A visceral, damning portrait of anger that he knew would outweigh any lingering doubt, any shred of sympathy. The jury deliberated for a mere 4 hours. A startlingly brief interval for a case carrying such profound weight, for a life hanging in the balance. During those 4 hours, they requested to view the cemetery video again. Not the entire, agonizing funeral, not the moments of earlier, perhaps genuine, tears, not the full, complex tapestry of her grief. No. They saw only that single, meticulously selected fragment. A short, damning clip, presented devoid of context, yet imbued with enough emotional power to eclipse any physical evidence, any logical argument. In February of 1997, the verdict was returned. Darlie was found guilty of the murder of Damon. The sentence was swift, absolute, and chillingly final: death by lethal injection. The case of Damon never saw a second trial. The maximum penalty had already been imposed, sealing its fate, closing the door on any further legal recourse. Yet, as the years stretched on, a disquieting truth began to emerge from the shadows of that verdict. Several members of the jury, haunted by their decision, spoke publicly. They confessed that the cemetery video, that single, isolated clip, had weighed upon their judgment as heavily, perhaps even more so, than any tangible piece of physical evidence. One juror, his voice heavy with regret, even went so far as to declare that had he witnessed the complete recording, the full spectrum of her grief, he would never have voted to condemn her. The trial may have ended, but the case itself, the unsettling questions it raised, refused to be buried. The defense, relentless in their pursuit of truth, turned their attention to a piece of evidence previously dismissed, deemed insignificant. On the coffee table, amidst the chaos and tragedy, a single latent fingerprint had been discovered. The defense vehemently insisted it belonged to an adult, an individual who was emphatically not a member of the family. To identify this mysterious print, a grim, desperate measure was taken. The children's remains were exhumed, their small fingerprints carefully taken and compared. Darlie's own prints were scrutinized, as were those of every individual who had been present at the scene. Each comparison yielded the same, unnerving result: no match. The print remained an enigma, a phantom trace. And yet, for years, the state steadfastly refused to cross-reference this unidentified print against national databases. A decision that, for those who believe in Darlie's innocence, transforms that single, silent fingerprint into the most profoundly disturbing, most terrifyingly unresolved aspect of the entire case. A chilling whisper of another presence, another hand, another truth hidden in the dark. There was a mark, a faint, unsettling impression left by someone who had been there that night, a phantom presence never truly identified. It lingered, a silent testament to an unknown visitor, a shadow woven into the fabric of that horrific scene, whispering questions no one seemed to want to answer. Over time, shadows began to fall across the testimony of Tom Bevel, the celebrated bloodstain pattern analyst. His intricate interpretations, once presented as irrefutable scientific truth, started to unravel under the weight of scrutiny. This was not the first time Bevel's work had faced such harsh light. He had been a key figure in other high-profile convictions, cases that later became deeply questioned, their foundations cracking under the pressure of new evidence and evolving forensic understanding. The very bedrock of his expertise, so pivotal in sealing Darlie's fate, now seemed to shift, threatening to pull the entire structure of the prosecution's case down with it. What does it mean for justice when the very science used to condemn is later revealed as fallible, or worse, flawed? A profound silence often enveloped the neighborhood, not the peaceful kind, but one heavy with unspoken fear, where doors remained shut and gazes averted. Amidst this chilling quiet, a crucial piece of information remained buried, locked away from the jury. Dr. Kennedy, the state's forensic psychiatrist, had conducted a thorough evaluation of Darlie. His professional assessment, a beacon of clinical objectivity, concluded that Darlie was neither a sociopath nor a danger to society. This was an expert opinion, a voice of reason from within the state's own system, directly contradicting the narrative of a cold-blooded killer. Yet, the jury, entrusted with determining her destiny, was never allowed to hear it. They were left to deliberate, to weigh a life in the balance, without the full spectrum of psychological insight that could have offered a profoundly different perspective. The truth, sometimes, is not what is said, but what is deliberately withheld. Years later, another unsettling truth began to surface, circling the medication Darlie had been taking with regularity: fen. A legal analyst, whose career had been intimately intertwined with cases involving this very drug, spoke of its insidious potential. She revealed its documented side effects: profound sleep disturbances, crippling memory loss, volatile mood swings, and a suffocating depression. This revelation alone could not declare Darlie innocent, but it cracked open a new window into the perplexing aspects of her behavior that had so relentlessly condemned her. Consider the diary, filled with entries hinting at suicidal thoughts, a document used to paint her as unstable, disturbed. Consider the shifts in her narrative, seemingly inconsistent, interpreted as the lies of a guilty mind. Consider the extreme, bone-deep fatigue that had plagued her in the weeks leading up to that night, a weariness beyond explanation. Darlie had been taking fen for approximately 4 months before the crime. The full extent of its influence on the events of that night remains shrouded in uncertainty, a question mark hanging over everything. What is undeniably clear is that during the trial, this critical medical context, this potential explanation for so many damning details, was never addressed with the gravity it deserved. Too often, the nuances of truth, the vital mitigating factors that fail to be thoroughly debated in the courtroom, arrive too late, long after the gavel has fallen, long after a life has been irrevocably shattered by a conviction. Other testimonies, whispers from the edges of the official investigation, also began to emerge, never taken with the seriousness they warranted. A neighbor recounted a terrifying incident that same night, around 1:30 in the morning: 2 men, shadowy figures, attempting to force their way into her home. Another woman came forward, her memory haunted by the sight of 2 suspicious individuals in the immediate vicinity shortly after 2 in the morning, one of them conspicuously barefoot. These unsettling leads, these glimpses of potential alternative realities, were swiftly dismissed. They surfaced too late, the authorities claimed, or they were too vague, too muddled to be considered valid. Yet, they remain, etched into the cold, official archives of the case, a persistent, uncomfortable part of a larger pattern. For some, these ignored threads are proof that the police, once they had chosen their culprit, simply lost the will to pursue any other path, their focus narrowed, their vision fixed. A similar fate befell reports of a dark, ominous car seen cruising through the quiet neighborhood in the days preceding the tragedy. A silent observer, perhaps, or something far more sinister. The life of a family, already fractured, continued to unfold in the cruelest way imaginable. The formal dissolution of their marriage arrived in June of 2011. Darren, her former husband, severed the legal ties that bound them, yet a strange, unsettling loyalty seemed to persist. Even after the ink dried on the divorce papers, a public defense of Darlie continued to emanate from him, a peculiar echo in the maelstrom of accusations. What hidden currents still flowed between them? What unspoken truths did he carry, that compelled him to stand by a woman condemned by so many? Upstairs, that night, a baby slept. Drake, oblivious to the horror unfolding below, would awaken to a world irrevocably shattered. He grew, not with the playful chatter of siblings, but under the suffocating weight of an unspeakable tragedy, forever marked by the absence of those he never knew. His childhood was a corridor of shadows, cast by the specter of what happened, and that chilled his own battle against leukemia, a fight he miraculously won. Yet, the fight for his mother's freedom, for her name, continued to consume him. In every interview, in every subsequent piece of material, Drake's voice has remained unwavering, a solitary beacon in the darkness. He believes. He visits. He supports. He clings to the hope of seeing her walk free, one day. Consider the unbearable dichotomy that defines his existence. If Darlie is, in fact, guilty, then Drake has spent a lifetime clutching a monstrous lie, his very foundation built upon a fabrication so profound it defies comprehension. His love, his loyalty, his unwavering belief, all reduced to a tragic delusion. But if she is innocent, if her pleas are true, then Drake has endured an equally horrifying reality, watching the very apparatus of the state relentlessly pursue and condemn the only woman who emerged alive from that blood-soaked dawn. The sole survivor, branded as the architect of destruction, by the very system sworn to protect. The defense, unyielding in its quest, began pushing for new DNA testing as early as 2008. They sought to re-examine crucial pieces of evidence, items that had never been subjected to the advanced forensic technologies now available. It was a glacial process, a relentless battle against a tide of bureaucratic red tape, staunch state resistance, and the crushing burden of escalating costs. Everhausen 14, a significant judicial order finally emerged, a glimmer of hope in the protracted darkness. Then, in 2018, a critical decision mandated that specific analyses proceed with the direct oversight and participation of both the prosecution and the defense, a testament to the contentious nature of the ongoing dispute. Years later, in 2021, the Innocence Project, a beacon for those caught in the labyrinth of legal doubt, stepped in, assuming the prohibitive shipping expenses and igniting a crucial new phase of review. Each date marks a chapter in a desperate, grinding struggle, a testament to the enduring questions that refuse to be silenced. To this very day, Darlie remains incarcerated, a prisoner of a system that has yet to set a definitive date for her fate. The specter of a capital punishment sentence still hangs heavy, a chilling reminder of the ultimate penalty. All eyes now turn to the results of those nascent DNA tests, awaited with bated breath, seen as perhaps her very last chance at salvation, her final desperate bid for freedom. Yet, through all the years, through all the legal battles and the crushing weight of public opinion, her voice has never wavered. She has steadfastly maintained the same story she uttered on that first, horrific day. She did not harm her children, and she did not inflict those wounds upon herself. Perhaps this unwavering denial, contrasted with the grim reality of her conviction, explains why the case of Darlie Routier continues to fester, a source of profound discomfort even decades later. It is not that the thought of her guilt is entirely unfathomable. No, the true unease stems from the chilling realization that a sentence of such extreme gravity, a life taken by the state, rests upon a foundation so demonstrably dubious. Most criminal cases find their closure in the irrefutable weight of a confession, the stark certainty of DNA evidence, the silent gaze of a security camera, or the unwavering testimony of a direct witness. This case, however, offered none of that. Instead, it was built upon a shifting sand of interpretations, how she acted, how she appeared, the fleeting impressions she left on those who watched her. It became a brutal, protracted battle between technical evidence, a clash of experts and data, which, over time, devolved into a deeply personal, emotionally charged conflict. And when raw emotion begins to weigh so heavily in a case where the stakes are so impossibly high, where the irreversible specter of a profound error looms, the true terror begins to set in. It is a fear that chills to the very bone. The deepest horror of this story is not merely the chilling prospect of a mother ending the lives of her own children. No, the true darkness lies in the agonizing reality of a wounded woman, judged not by concrete evidence, but by her very essence, her demeanor, her appearance, even the way her tears fell upon a grave. She has languished for decades within a cold cell, while the unsettling shadow of doubt, a living, breathing entity, continues to haunt the very pages of her official record. This is one of those rare cases that truly leaves a gnawing uncertainty in its wake, forcing a visceral re-evaluation of whether justice, in its blind pursuit, sometimes falters, choosing not truth, but merely the easiest target for its wrath. A cold cell. A lingering doubt. A life consumed. The gavel's final strike echoed, a hollow sound against the weight of a life irrevocably altered. A woman, Darlie, her name now synonymous with unspeakable horror, stood condemned. With the spectral whispers of doubt that clung to every piece of evidence, every testimony. Consider the unknown print, a rogue signature left behind, a phantom clue that never found its owner. It spoke of a presence, an unseen hand, a shadow in the night that was never fully accounted for. This chilling anomaly, a silent testament to a truth perhaps never fully unearthed, was dismissed, a loose thread in a tapestry declared complete. And then, the sock, a small, mundane item transformed into an object of grotesque significance, stained with a story that seemed to shift with every new perspective, its bloody fibers screaming a narrative that few truly believed had been fully heard. Years have passed, yet the echoes persist. Whispers of new evidence, held captive in the cold grip of legal limbo, threaten to unravel the carefully constructed narrative, to rip open old wounds and expose the raw, festering doubts that have always lingered beneath the surface. It forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth: when a conviction, a human life, rests upon foundations so deeply permeated by uncertainty, the very ground beneath justice begins to tremble.